There's a very specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from working too hard in one moment, but from never mentally clocking out. It's when money is the background noise of your entire life. You wake up thinking about it, you fall asleep doing the math in your head, and even on the rare moments you're supposed to be relaxing, there's a low-grade panic humming underneath everything. If you stop pushing, if you stop checking, if you stop optimizing for even a second, it feels like the whole thing might collapse. What makes this especially brutal is that from the outside, it often looks like you're doing everything right. You're earning, you're saving, you're investing, you're being responsible, and yet somehow, instead of feeling secure, you feel trapped, tired, slightly behind, like you're running on a treadmill that speeds up every time you start to catch your breath. Most people assume that feeling is just the price of building wealth. That stress is proof you're on the right path. That financial independence, if it ever arrives, only comes after decades of sacrifice, obsession, and quietly wrecking your mental health along the way. But when you zoom out and look at the people who actually reach long-term financial stability without burning out, something interesting shows up. They aren't grinding harder. They aren't thinking about money more often. In many cases, they're thinking about it far less. The uncomfortable truth is that constant effort is not the same thing as progress. And in finance especially, effort without structure often turns into anxiety instead of results. When most of us picture someone wealthy, the image is extreme. Someone pulling endless hours, consumed by work, chasing the next deal, or staring at market charts like their life depends on it. Or we imagine someone who got lucky, an inheritance, a perfectly timed investment, a business that exploded at exactly the right moment. Those people exist, but they're not the rule. They're the exception that gets the spotlight. The quieter reality is that a lot of long-term wealth is built in a way that's almost boring. It doesn't rely on intensity, it relies on systems. The people who make it sustainable figure out how to remove themselves from the daily decision-making loop. Their money grows not because they're constantly doing something clever, but because they've set things up, so it doesn't require their attention to keep working. That distinction changes everything. Most financial stress isn't caused by a lack of intelligence or discipline. It comes from trying to manage money manually in a world that constantly demands your focus. Every decision pulls from the same limited mental energy you're using for work, relationships, and basic life maintenance. Eventually, something gives. Usually the plan. This is where traditional financial messaging quietly goes wrong. It often frames wealth building as an exercise in restriction. Spend less, cut more, say no, delay gratification indefinitely. Treat every dollar like it's about to disappear forever. While that approach can work short-term, psychologically, it's fragile. When everything feels like deprivation, rebellion becomes inevitable. One unexpected expense or emotionally charged decision can undo months of progress. People who build wealth without that boom and bust cycle tend to reframe the entire problem. Instead of asking how to shrink their lives to fit their income, they focus on building structures that allow progress to happen automatically. The emotional tone shifts from scarcity to intention. You're no longer constantly guarding against failure. You're designing a process that keeps moving even when you're tired, distracted, or focused on other things. Clarity plays a huge role here. Vague goals create vague behavior. Saying you want to be better with money gives your brain nothing to anchor to. But when you define what financial stability actually means to you, whether that's flexibility, security, or time, you stop drifting. Numbers stop being abstract threats and start becoming reference points. You're not reacting anymore. You're aiming. That's also why budgeting gets such a bad reputation. Most people experience it as punishment, a spreadsheet that tells them what they can't do. In reality, a budget is just a map. It replaces constant uncertainty with pre-made decisions. When you already know where your money is going, you don't have to negotiate with yourself every time you want to spend. The anxiety drops, not because you're spending less, but because you're spending on purpose. The reason budgets fail isn't because people are lazy. It's because they rely on willpower. Tracking every transaction manually works for a while, usually when motivation is high. Then life happens. attention drifts, the system collapses, and the failure feels personal, even though the structure was never sustainable to begin with. The turning point for many people comes when they realize that consistency beats intensity, and automation beats motivation. When saving and investing happen by default, before money ever feels available, the emotional struggle disappears. There's no daily decision to be made, no internal debate. The plan runs quietly in the background while you focus on living. This doesn't mean living like a monk. In fact, it often feels like the opposite. When the future is handled first, the money that remains feels safe to use. You adapt your lifestyle to what's left instead of constantly worrying about what you should be holding back. Over time, that adjustment becomes normal. Not painful, not dramatic, just stable. One of the most overlooked benefits of this approach isn't financial at all. It's psychological. When progress is automatic, you stop checking constantly. You stop tying your mood to market fluctuations or account balances. You regain mental space. And that space changes how you show up in your work, your relationships, and your health. Before any of this works, though, there's one unglamorous foundation that tends to get skipped because it doesn't feel exciting: liquidity. Having cash set aside for the unexpected isn't about optimization. It's about resilience. Without it, every surprise becomes a crisis. Investments get interrupted. Debt fills the gaps. Stress compounds. A basic emergency buffer changes behavior in subtle but powerful ways. It slows down panic. It creates time to think. It allows you to respond instead of react. That emotional stability often matters more than the actual dollar amount because it prevents the kinds of rushed decisions that derail long-term plans. Once that foundation exists, growth becomes less fragile. You're no longer forced to undo progress every time life throws something inconvenient your way. The system can absorb shocks without breaking. And that's the real difference between people who stay stuck in cycles and people who quietly move forward year after year. The irony is that the most sustainable way to build wealth often feels anticlimactic. There's no constant adrenaline, no dramatic wins to brag about, just steady movement in the right direction. But over time, that quiet consistency compounds, not just financially, but emotionally. Money stops being the center of your life and becomes what it was always supposed to be, a tool supporting it. And when that shift happens, something surprising follows. You don't just build more wealth. You actually get to enjoy the life you're building it for. Most people don't lose at investing because they're reckless. They lose because they're distracted. They're chasing something exciting, something secret, something that feels like it should exist, because surely building wealth can't be this slow and uneventful. Somewhere out there, they assume, is the right stock, the right strategy, the right moment. Miss it, and you're behind forever. Catch it, and everything changes. That belief is powerful. It's also one of the most expensive ideas people carry around. The reality is far less dramatic and far more uncomfortable. Wealth tends to come from patience doing the same unremarkable thing for a very long time. Not brilliance, not perfect timing. Time itself is the multiplier. And most people underestimate it because time doesn't feel productive in the moment. It feels like waiting. At the center of this is a concept everyone has heard of, but few truly respect: compounding. Not as a formula, but as a force. When money earns returns, and those returns stay invested long enough to earn their own returns, the growth stops being linear. It starts bending upward, slowly at first, almost invisibly. Then, years later, it becomes hard to ignore. What makes this so unintuitive is that compounding rewards time far more than effort. A single decision made early can outweigh years of aggressive action taken later. Delay doesn't just slow progress. It permanently shrinks what's possible. That's why starting sooner often matters more than starting perfectly. This is also why so many people overestimate the importance of picking individual winners. The idea that wealth comes from spotting the next big thing is emotionally satisfying. It makes success feel earned through intelligence rather than endurance. But over long periods, broad participation in markets has historically been difficult to beat with constant trading. The more decisions you make, the more chances there are to make the wrong one at the wrong time. There's a quiet advantage to approaches that don't require constant involvement. Diversified exposure, held patiently, doesn't generate stories worth telling at dinner parties. What it may generate is consistency. And consistency is what keeps people invested long enough for compounding to matter. This is where boredom becomes a feature, not a flaw. When a strategy doesn't demand attention, it leaves room for a life. You're not checking prices every morning. You're not tying your emotional state to short-term movements you can't control anyway. The money does what it does, and you do something else with your time. That separation is psychologically important. Because the more your identity gets wrapped up in your portfolio, the harder it becomes to stay rational. Distance protects you from yourself. Another misunderstood piece of this puzzle is income that isn't directly tied to hours worked. Not because it's magical or effortless, but because it scales differently. When assets generate cash flow, even modest amounts, they begin to change how money feels. It's no longer only something you chase, it's something that arrives. Dividend-paying businesses are one example people often point to, not because they're exciting, but because they're predictable. When profits are shared with owners and those payments are reinvested over time, the effect compounds in two directions at once: value growth and income growth. On its own, it may feel incremental. Over decades, it can quietly reshape outcomes. The key detail here is reinvestment. When cash flow is redirected back into the system, it accelerates future cash flow. That feedback loop is slow, steady, and remarkably resilient. It doesn't care about headlines. It doesn't need constant supervision. It just needs time and restraint. Real assets operate on similar principles. Real estate, when managed conservatively, often combines income with long-term appreciation. It's not passive in the way marketing brochures suggest, and it carries risks that aren't always obvious up front. But structurally, it shares something important with other durable wealth builders. Someone else is contributing to the asset's growth over time. When done prudently, that can reduce reliance on your own labor alone. None of this works particularly well without diversification, which is often misunderstood as playing it safe. In reality, diversification is about survival. It's acknowledging that no one knows which asset, sector, or strategy will dominate next. By spreading exposure, you reduce the chance that a single mistake or downturn defines your entire outcome. Different assets behave differently under stress. Some respond better to growth. Others tend to hold up during contraction. A mix doesn't eliminate volatility, but it can make volatility tolerable. And tolerable volatility is what keeps people invested through difficult periods, instead of exiting at precisely the wrong moment. Age, goals, and temperament all influence how that mix looks. Someone with decades ahead of them can usually absorb more fluctuation. Someone closer to needing the money often prioritizes stability and income. There's no universal answer, only trade-offs. The common thread is balance. One factor that consistently undermines all of this is high-interest debt. Unlike market returns, interest on consumer debt is certain. It compounds too, just in the wrong direction. When interest rates are high, the math becomes unforgiving. Progress elsewhere has to work harder just to offset guaranteed losses. This is why many long-term builders focus on reducing expensive debt early, not because it's glamorous, but because it removes a structural headwind. Every dollar no longer sent to interest becomes a dollar with options. The shift isn't just financial, it's mental. You stop financing the past and start freeing up capacity for the future. As balances fall, something subtle happens. Risk tolerance improves, stress declines, decisions get clearer, momentum returns. Not because income changed, but because friction disappeared. As wealth grows, complexity increases, and taxes quietly become one of the largest variables affecting outcomes. It's rarely the most exciting topic, but structure matters. Money that compounds without annual erosion has more time to work. Accounts designed to delay or reduce taxes don't change effort levels, but they can materially change results over long horizons. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't require obsession, it requires awareness. Knowing where growth is sheltered, where it's exposed, and how timing affects what you keep can make the difference between progress that feels stalled and progress that quietly accelerates. None of this is about shortcuts. There are no guarantees hiding here. Markets fluctuate. Assets underperform. Life intervenes. What systems do is absorb that uncertainty better than willpower ever could. They don't eliminate risk. They manage it. When you zoom out far enough, the pattern becomes clear. People who build wealth without burning out aren't doing more. They're deciding less. They automate what can be automated. They remove emotion where emotion causes harm. They accept that slow progress sustained beats, fast progress abandoned. Wealth, in its most durable form, is not loud. It doesn't demand constant attention. It doesn't require you to sacrifice your health, your relationships, or your sanity. It grows in the background while you're busy living a life that actually feels worth protecting. That's the part that often gets missed. The goal isn't to win a financial game. It's to design one that lets you step away from the table without everything falling apart. When money starts working quietly, you get your time back. And time, used well, tends to be the most valuable return of all.